all you feminines out there. This is Beckah.
And this is Leigh.
And we're really excited to be back to be giving you another episode of File 741 today. We apologize for the hiatus, but as you well know, last year was difficult. And both of us kind of got to a point where we were a little overwhelmed with what was going on. I feel like the end of the year was really difficult, so we had to take a little break. But now we're back, and we're really excited.
Yes, totally agree.
Exactly. So we were going to originally do this episode back in November, but we are here to bring it to you in January. And one thing that I was going to mention back in November, so we are going to be talking about comics that were written by Native and Indigenous writers and creators. And, you know, we were going to talk about it in November, but one thing I did want to point out was that it's important for us to be reading and exploring these stories all year round. You know, like we don't have to limit our knowledge and exploration of Black stories during Black History Month. You know, we don't have to focus just on Native stories in November to kind of do an anti-Thanksgiving thing. So I'm excited to start a new year with this new episode talking about these things, because I think it's really good to remember that these are things that are happening all the time, and it's important to think about that.
I agree with that, and it's also a good time for us to be reading this, because I feel like now that we've switched administrations and, you know, it just seems like a much more positive future, and so this was a perfect one to start our year with.
Exactly. And along those same lines, you know, all the changes that we are seeing for the good are the results of many, many, many years of hard work by people within Black communities, within Indigenous communities, that are striving to make things better for everyone. And so, you know, along those same lines, there's always a lot of talk about acknowledging the land that was stolen from the Native people who were here in North America. And so on that note, you know, I live in Utah right now. I did used to live in Colorado, but I moved here last year. And so this land is Ute, Eastern Shoshone, and Goshute land. I do apologize if I am mispronouncing any of those, but that is the land that I live on.
Yes, and I still live in Colorado. I live in kind of the Aurora area, and so our territory land is under Arapaho.
Yeah, and one other thing I wanted to mention before we really delve into this, I've probably talked about this in the past when we have gotten into comics that were written by people that are of a different race and ethnicity than I am. I am white, and so I'm trying really hard to educate myself and be very sensitive and knowledgeable about the issues that are surrounding Native and Indigenous people, but I'm going to make mistakes. And I would ask that if I do, please call me in and remind me of the history and the things that I should be learning so that I can be better and to talk about it with other people. So that is something that I'm trying to work on as we kind of get into this a little bit more.
That's great, Becca. Thank you for saying that. And that, you know, goes the same for me as well. I'm Hispanic, so neither one of us are, you know, Indigenous, but we want to definitely honor and respect those cultures.
Yeah, so to get started, you know, one thing that was really important for us is when we were choosing these comics is to choose comics that were both written by Indigenous people. You know, we wanted to make sure that the representation was accurate and was coming from the right community, but also that the stories were not limited to the trauma that Indigenous and Native people have experienced. While those are major themes in the comics that we're going to talk about today, I think there's also a lot of hope and a lot of triumph and a lot of creativity that we see in these comics, and so that is important for us as well. We don't want to capitalize on the trauma of these people, and what they're experiencing and have experienced and are still experiencing. So the first comic that we're going to talk about is a girl called Echo, the Pemmican Wars, by Katharina Vermette, illustrated by Scott B. Henderson and Donovan Yachuik, or Yatsiuk. And excuse me again for mispronouncing your name. But as a brief kind of overview, Echo Desjardins, a 13-year-old Métis girl adjusting to a new home and school, is struggling with loneliness while separated from her mother. Then an ordinary day in Mr. Bree's history class turns extraordinary, and Echo's life will never be the same. During Mr. Bree's lecture, Echo finds herself transported to another time and place, a bison hunt on the Saskatchewan prairie, and back again to the present. In the following weeks, Echo slips back and forth in time. She visits a Métis camp, travels the old fur trade routes, and experiences the perilous and bygone era of the Pemmican Wars. And this currently has 3 volumes. I only read the first 2, but I really enjoyed this comic. It really has such a cool story, and the artwork especially, I think, does a really, really good job of portraying Echo's story and what she's experiencing. And maybe you can speak a little bit more about that.
I agree. This one was one of my very favorites of the ones that we had read. I love a time travel
Of course.
storyline, so this was fun for me. And yeah, I was able to read all 3 volumes, and it was interesting, the storyline. I think artwork wise, it was more sketchy, which I liked. And so not sketchy in a bad way, but sketchy, like, you can see the drawing lines a little bit more. It wasn't so crisp like a lot of the newer comics are that are done, far more digitally. I still think it was probably done somewhat digitally, but I just, for some reason, there was a smoother, more artistic way that it looked. And the coloring was interesting as well, especially when she goes from the future or the present to the past. The past, I think I found, was more colorful and had like warmer tones to it, and then her present was a little bit more. It wasn't black and white, but it was definitely a little bit more muted and gray. And I think that speaks to how she's feeling. It definitely had a darker tone to it. And then as for the story, I'm trying to think back because it's been a little bit since I had read it. I think was it music that I think that was her way of going back into the past. She had a MP3 player, or maybe it was her phone, I'm not sure, but I think it was an MP3 player, and then there were specific songs that she would listen to, and then it would take her back in time. And I really liked that too, because I kind of feel that actually happens sometimes in real life when you're listening to music. Like, music, when you're listening to it personally like that, can very easily transform you back into a memory or a time when you first heard this or what this reminds you of. And so I really thought that was beautiful, that's how they added that for her to go back in time. And then when she goes back in time, it seems like she's a new character. It's not like she embodied somebody of her ancestry, but it seems like people are familiar with her still. And so I thought that was very interesting as well. And then she's meeting all the characters that are, they're not really characters. They're actually people probably in actual history that she's learning about in her class, which I also think would be interesting. I think that would be fascinating to go back in time during these times when you're in a history class and you're learning about these different situations. Terrifying as well, because it was in the middle of a bit of a war. But yeah, I think being able to take history and making it a live action and like what it would have really been like is what makes history so fascinating and interesting, and takes it outside of a textbook.
Yeah, absolutely. In pretty much all of these stories that we're going to talk about today, I really appreciate the way that history is taught in this very personal way.
Mm-hmm.
So they're like these facts and these things that actually happened, and these very epic things that do kind of feel like they belong in a textbook that are brought to life. And so going along with the artwork, in the real world, everything around her is very faded and she doesn't feel very connected to it. But once she travels back in time, it's all the same color palette and she fits right in. Nobody says like, why are you wearing those weird clothes? Or like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, at one point somebody says, where did you come from? And she's like, I don't know. And he just is like, okay. So like she fits in so well that she starts to take those things that she's experiencing, those things that she's feeling, and transferring them to the real world. And in that process, she becomes more connected with her family. She starts to talk to her
Mm-hmm.
mom a little bit, who is also very disconnected from her Métis heritage. And they kind of share that a little bit, and she becomes a little bit more vibrant. And so I think it's really a cool way to see how she becomes more involved and brightens, and her
Mm-hmm.
world brightens around her as she becomes more attuned to that culture.
Yeah, I really appreciate that as well, because I feel, as somebody, I'm half Hispanic and half Italian, and so I never really got the opportunity to really understand or connect with either of my cultural backgrounds or heritage. And so I really appreciate stories and people who take the time to really like delve into their history and their ancestors. And even though these are people that, have not been alive for many, many years, that connection of like, this is part of me, this is part of my heritage, my ancestry, this is part of my story, part of my family, and finding that connection, I'm always very, very intrigued by that, and wish that it was the same for me. And so that's something that I strive to do in my life, is to at some point find that kind of connection and start to go into family histories and learn about where I came from and where my people came from and stuff like that. So it's just yeah, I don't know. So these stories, in particular, really connect to me, because I really think that I just think that there's a beauty in that, in being able to really connect with your family history like that.
Absolutely. I'm half German and half like English Welsh, um, like pioneer, quote unquote,
Mm-hmm.
stock. And so, my history is one of violence and
Mm-hmm.
colonization and um, hatred and racism. So, it's almost more important for me to get into these stories to really understand the extent to which my ancestors affected the lives of these people and find ways to rectify that. And
That's
that's
very
hard
true. Yeah.
sometimes, but not as hard as the things that these people have experienced.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, I think it's definitely important on both sides. It's important for colonizers and white people to look into these things and really learn this history, and important for people to find connection to that family and to that heritage. Um, Unless you had something else about a girl called Echo, I think this is a good segue into surviving the city.
Yeah, one thing I just want to mention too, like I said, I have Italian on my side too, and they also not great. And so yeah, it I think part of also delving into your history and your ancestry is also coming to terms that some of it is not going to be great. But
Yeah.
because you take the time to understand that and see that and not make those same mistakes, then that also, like, the history repeating itself situation. So you have to educate yourself on that, so that we can better ourselves as a society and not continue the terrible mistakes of the past.
Exactly. And that's something I want to get into a little bit more when we talk about the outside circle. But
Mm-hmm.
next, I want to talk about surviving the city.
Mm-hmm.
So I just read volume one. It's by Tasha Spillett, and it was illustrated by Natasha Donovan. And it's about womanhood, friendship, colonialism, and the anguish of missing a loved one. Mikwon and Des are best friends. Mikwon is Anishinaabe, and Des is Innu. Together, the teens navigate the challenges of growing up in an urban landscape. They're so close they even completed their berry fast together. However, when Des's grandmother becomes too sick, Des is told she can't stay with her anymore. With the threat of a group home looming, Des can't bring herself to go home and she disappears. Mikwon is devastated, and the wound of her missing mother resurfaces. So this story also really specifically touches on womanhood and friendship within Indigenous communities, but also, really specifically talks about the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women, which is a really, really devastating thing that is continuing to happen. But I felt like this comic in general, what I love about it is that it's ultimately hopeful and triumphant, that at the end, Mikwon really feels, she's always felt that connection to her mother, but she feels even more strongly connected to her community and is willing to fight for recognition and for representation. And so I feel like it ends, in this volume at least, on a very positive note, even though it's very difficult to navigate what they're experiencing in the content of the story.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. Yeah, this one caused me a little anxiety, I would say, because I was just as anxious about her friend. And like you said, the the violence towards Indigenous women. I feel like that's a commonality also with my Hispanic heritage. And so, yeah, I mean, I've never experienced that kind of violence or known someone in my family or, friendship circle that has experienced that, but it makes me anxious thinking about it. Any kind of crime of that nature as a woman really, kind of sparks a little trauma there. And so that one, yeah, I was just as anxious as she was, trying to find her friend and hoping that it was not going to turn out to be something awful. And so I was very glad that it did not turn out that way. And then it did have a hopeful message. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really love the artwork of this
Mm-hmm.
comic. It's really fresh and it's very free.
Mm-hmm.
It does kind of have this kind of, again, not sketchiness, but like this looseness that I really love, that kind of lends
Mm-hmm.
itself to the story. It's not in any way like unrealistic or fantastical,
Mm-hmm.
even though the spirits that are present, are a part of the story throughout. And I think that's something that's, very common within, as far as I understand, within Native and Indigenous cultures, that is not a part of my heritage in the same way,
Mm-hmm.
that the the idea of like ghosts and death in the European heritage is very like scary, and
Mm-hmm.
we can't handle death, and don't know how to deal with it and all this stuff. But this is another way in which it's important to recognize that, you know, that their ancestors are always with them. They're always offering protection,
Mm-hmm.
even though the specter of violence is always there. It's always following the cop, and it's always following the white man who's like, hey, you want to ride? Or, is holding the
Mm-hmm.
door open, but is, has violence kind of imprinted in his heart,
Mm-hmm.
that um those spirits can be both comforting and frightening.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that it's kind of incorporated into the story, and the way that it ultimately ends with Miquan at the end saying, I really feel like my mom is with me here at this march.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then ultimately is reunited with Des, that makes it so beautiful and again positive and triumphant.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's definitely a beauty to that, and yeah, I agree with the part about spirits. Like, I think, the so-called white version of spirits does tend to be more of a fear of death and it being a scary thing. And that's one thing that I do appreciate more about other cultures and their versions of spirits. Is that there's also a lot more. Like, I feel like it's not just the Christian, like good versus evil type thing.
Right.
It's nice to see that there are so many variations of spirits, and like I said, some good, some more menacing. But you know, they all serve a purpose, and I think that's kind of cool. So yeah.
Yeah, so one thing I did a little bit of extra research on with this comic was kind of learning about what a berry fast was.
Yeah, I was
Um,
interested in that
so
as
it
well.
Yeah, it sounds like, as far as I understand it, it really happens when a girl begins to menstruate. So it's a
Hmm.
way for these young women to kind of grow up out of childhood, like leave childhood behind and become women
Hmm.
in their communities. And what I really like about it is, there's some very specific rules and traditions that they follow that like you're not allowed to hold children. You pretty much seclude yourself during menstruation, but it's a time of like learning from your elders and it's a time of growth. And it's not because you are unclean, which is
Hmm.
a very like Christian
Yeah.
thing, but it's because you're too powerful. Is
Yeah.
that you're so powerful that your body, like, you can't step over a man because you may take his power, because your body is just too powerful at that time. And I think that's so cool that you know I grew up in a culture in which menstruation is like not talked about and it's gross and dirty. And
Hmm.
I was embarrassed when I first had my period and like didn't tell my family for a few months because I was like mortified. And so it's really cool to kind of see that portrayed so naturally. And it was again an opportunity for me to learn something and appreciate another culture's tradition, especially when it comes to something that's like a part of the quote unquote sacred feminine.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how other cultures treat menstruation, because I think in our culture, it's like you said, it's something you don't talk about it, or it's a shame situation, it's something
Yeah.
to feel icky and gross and dirty about. And I just, you know, we don't really have any fun traditions of like when you first become a woman, and there's not like a celebration about that. Like you said, it's something that you should not feel good about type thing. And I think that that's wrong. And I appreciate so much that other cultures kind of celebrate it or, acknowledge it. And then on the power side of that, I mean, I enjoy any kind of situation where they acknowledge that women have power, and that menstruation is not something that holds you back in some way or is considered like a fault. I mean, once I had a teacher once who was discussing menstruation, and it was a world religions class, and so and how that was kind of portrayed in different type of religions and cultures around the world. And one thing that she said, I can't remember the certain culture she was discussing at the time, but she said that they treated it um, as like a form of the miraculous, basically, because here is a
Mm.
woman who can bleed for 5 days and not die, whereas if you cut a man and they bled for 5 days, they would die. And so there's like that's your power
Yeah.
there, is that you have the power to to full on bleed and still live and survive. And that was considered beautiful and considered holy in some ways, and I thought that was
Yeah.
really cool.
That is really cool. Speaking of education, before we move on, one theme that comes up a lot within these two stories is that both of the young women, Echo, Miquan, and Des, have access to like a cultural advisor, and specifically for Echo, like an Indigenous student leadership group at their school. So they have a good resource to turn to. And I was thinking, like, I mean, they may have existed when I was in school and I just wasn't aware of it because that wasn't a place for me. But I also don't remember like learning this type of history when I was in school.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't know if you had a similar experience. You know, I grew up in California and then in Southern Oregon, um, and then Eastern Oregon. And it feels like there should have been more opportunities for teachers to like really talk about the history of the land and the history of the people who used to live there, and that sort of thing, and I just didn't really feel like I got that. So I was wondering what your experience was.
Well, as an educator, I've learned quite a bit. Um, so I also had that experience of not learning about any of the, you know, things that I would consider to be important details of our history. And that tends to be a cultural situation, and I don't know if it's just in America, it could be other countries too, but like that kind of conforming of society and like, you know, hiding some of the things that they're not proud about in their personal history. And so in textbooks, depending on the certain textbook, they're going to omit stuff or
Right.
flat out just lie about it type of thing, you know. And so because education is also somewhat considered a business,
Mm.
you know, that's why textbooks are so expensive, is because you know, here it's a book, it shouldn't be any more expensive than any other book, but because it's used, you know, circulated in an education and everything like that, that's a whole company, and that's a whole, you know,
Mm.
means of making money. And so, you know, it's a way of selling your textbook better if there's less controversial stuff in it, and
Mm.
then
Yeah.
you know, the district does not have to worry about, you know, ruffling feathers or, you know, kids necessarily learning things that maybe their parents would have a problem with, things like that. So I mean, that's the only issue. I mean, that's not the only issue I have with education. I have tons of issues with education as an educator. But one of the issues that I have is that, like, you know, I don't feel that students are getting an authentic experience when it comes to learning about history and social stuff. And so, like, in high school, the first time my eyes were opened was that world religions class. I had an amazing
Mm.
teacher. I'll shout her out, Jean Jackson. She's amazing. Still friends with her on Facebook these days.
Nice.
And yeah, she was an ex nun. She left the nunnery and became an educator.
Nice.
And she was just like the most amazing feminist. Like, she didn't sugarcoat a damn thing. Like, I learned so many things that I was like, oh my god, this was not in any. I mean, I've been taking history, you know, all the years of education, but especially, like, you know, in high school, you would think that it would be more specific. And I learned so much in her one class that was not mentioned in a single damn textbook.
Mm.
I would say, like, we learned about the Inquisition, I remember, and you would think that that would be something huge that would be in a fucking, you know, textbook, but that was the first time I had heard of it in all 4 years of high school learning history
Yeah.
of the world. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. And so, you know, had I had not taken that class, I would have, like, obliviously, you know, continued to go into college not knowing stuff that is really important. You
Yeah.
know, like, when I thought of the Inquisition, I thought of Monty Python, and what does that mean? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just, there's things that I just was like, oh my god, I cannot believe that this something this huge was omitted. And then I thought, okay, well, if something that huge was omitted, what about all those smaller things that, you know,
Right.
or what would be considered smaller things? I'm sure they're still, you know, horrific for each culture, but maybe not as well known. And so yeah, so college is kind of the time where you can maybe learn a little bit more depending on how progressive your college is and your, you know, professors are. But I mean, for the most part, a lot of that kind of true history you have to look for on yourself. And that's not the way
Mhm.
it should be in education. We shouldn't have to be like, you know, educating ourselves when we're going to get a free education. You know, that stuff should be openly presented. And so it's really, it's eye opening and it's heartbreaking uh, when you have to do it that way. So yeah, on your note, I don't remember having any cultural liaison whatsoever in high school. I don't even think we had guidance counselor. I mean, there was a guidance counselor, but you had to be proactive to go see them. It's not like anybody checked in with me and was like, "Hey, how's it going?" And you know, do you want to discuss this in any way, or you know, anything like that. I don't remember there being any person like that. I don't feel that high school really prepared me for the world or prepared me for even college for that matter. I was having a discussion like that with my. This is a little off topic, but you got me on education. Um,
I love your soapbox, by the way.
Thank you.
Please keep
Like I said,
standing upon it.
I
That's
can't,
great.
I have to bitch to somebody about it because, like I said, when you're just around all other educators, this is all we talk about. So it is nice to be able to talk to other people and be like, no, somebody needs to listen.
Yeah.
um, but I mean, like, my mom especially pointed out, she's like, you know, you didn't really, like, I don't know how it is in high schools these days, but I mean, now like home ec and stuff like that is considered outdated. And even
Mhm.
though it was a little, you know, culture, it was a little biased in some ways of, you know, gender biased with that, you know, like boys usually took shop and girls took home ec,
Yeah.
you know, at least, you know, you could make it where everybody has to take it. I mean, the fact that I went to college like not knowing how to cook and like, you know, or even just basic skills of like, I mean, this is outdated now, but like writing a check. I didn't know how to do
Right.
that until like I went to college and my mom was, and we opened my first like real bank account and my mom had to like show me and I'm like, what is happening here? Like, you know, all that, or like balancing a checkbook or balancing a budget or, you know, all these things,
Yeah.
that shit's not taught. And that's, you know, stuff that you, that's life stuff that you need to know. And like as much as like all this, you know, stuff of history and culture and all that is equally important, like just basic shit, you know, to help people live their daily lives should also be taught in high school. And so I feel like, you know, then when you graduate, it's like, great, I understand chemistry, but I don't know how to, you know, I don't know how to do laundry, I don't know how to do any of these things, and you know,
Right.
basic things that are, or I don't know how to, you know, buy a house or, you know, even, you know, sign a lease, you know, all these things
Yeah.
are things that, you know, there should be a class for that too. You know, I just feel like
Yeah.
we're not preparing our youth for adulthood in any way. And I feel like once they get to college, then it's like a major crash course. And there's so much remedial then because then you weren't taught all the things you were supposed to learn there. And then I think that discourages people and a lot of people drop out and then, you know, like it's a vicious circle.
Yeah.
And I especially feel that way about new math. Um, I've noticed in my particular district and area, you know, every year there's a different, you know, way to teach math or something like that. And then it's like a kid tried to show me once how they do it and I'm like, what are you doing? Because I showed them how to like stack the two and during, you know,
Yeah.
subtraction and addition, and they're like, what are you doing? I'm like, that's how you do that. And they showed me how they were doing. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, you know, that made no sense to me whatsoever. But then the issue is then they go to college and it's the way I learned, the old way. So like,
Right.
why did you go through all this trouble of teaching these kids this new way of math when they have to transfer back to the old way and they don't know how to do it then when they get to college? So,
Yeah.
you know, yeah. Anyway, sorry, that's my soapbox on
That's
education. So we are definitely not preparing people. We're not telling the truth. We're not doing what we need to be doing. And so like I especially feel like people of color would be totally pissed. I imagine, you know, because I mean their histories are the number one histories that are being erased in education, and that's not okay.
Yeah. I mean, along those same lines, I think while it's really, really important to have teachers reflect the lives of their students. So, like
Mm-hmm.
in A Girl Called Echo, like she has a non binary teacher, which is awesome, who is also Native. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that is something that I never would have experienced. Again, I'm not and Native or Indigenous. But like, that's something that, you know, I never really would have experienced when I was growing up. And so it's really important to have people who are very connected to this history and are able to teach that history. But it's also on the white people, the white educators, the white administrators, the boards, the, you know, district leaders, all of those people to be teaching that history. Like, you know, it's this whole thing of like, while representation is super important, the burden of education can't be put on them because, you know, that's my responsibility as a white person to learn this and to teach it. It's not, you know, I'm not going to be like, well, here's my Black friend, they're going to tell you all about Black history. Like, that's not their responsibility. So it's really hard, you know. I've seen this a lot recently within the publishing world. Like, the people who are in charge are the people who are white and are not giving those opportunities out to the people who really can make a difference. So yes, it's all tangled up, and it's very hard to untangle. But weirdly enough, I feel like this really helps us segue into the next comic that we were going to talk about, which is called The Outside Circle. And it has a whole message of like healing and reconciliation within your own community. So just as a brief kind of overview, this, I guess it's a graphic novel, could be described as, called The Outside Circle. And it's by Patty Laboucaine Benson, illustrated by Kelly Mellings. And in it, two Aboriginal brothers surrounded by poverty, drug abuse, and gang violence try to overcome centuries of historic trauma in very different ways to bring about positive change in their lives. Pete, a young Aboriginal man wrapped up in gang violence, lives with his younger brother, Joey, and his mother, who is a heroin addict. One night, Pete and his mother's boyfriend, Dennis, get into a big fight, which sends Dennis to the morgue and Pete to jail. Initially, Pete keeps up ties to his crew until a jail brawl forces him to realize the negative influence he has become on Joey, which encourages him to begin a process of rehabilitation that includes traditional Aboriginal healing circles and ceremonies. And I will say, too, I don't use the term Aboriginal as much. And so definitely, or First Nation, I tend to say Native and Indigenous, but, you know, I will try to follow that language when it's used specifically. So one thing that I really, really loved about this graphic novel is the symbolism and the imagery within it. It's, you know, it definitely has more of a kind of traditional kind of quote unquote artwork style that's very realistic. And so it has, you know, that realism, it has this gravity within the story, but then there's this really, really important and beautiful imagery. And one of those things is this mask that when Pete becomes like enraged, he puts on this mask, this kind of terrifying mask, that then the actions that he takes when he's wearing this mask lead him to jail, and then to, you know, get into this fight in jail, and ultimately he has to learn how to remove this mask. And there's a whole amazing sequence towards the end of the novel that really goes into that, about like sitting down with this mask and trying to figure out what it exactly is and who you are and whether or not this mask reflects you.
Yes.
But in general, like, there's just this really, really amazing story about these men. And, you know, the outside circle, as it's described, is the warriors, the men protecting their community, which the very inside is children. Outside of that is the elders who are teaching the children. Outside of that is the women who are caring for the elders and the children and providing for them. And then on the outside circle are the men who are the warriors who
Mm-hmm.
are protecting them. And it really gets into this idea of that it's hard to describe, but when he goes to this healing place, he is with his own community, and they spend a lot of time kind of unpacking the layers of oppression and racism and
Mm-hmm.
hatred and abuse and the things that they have experienced and are perpetuating, and why that is, and how to reconnect with their community to break outside of those circles. And what's really interesting and is done so beautifully too is another way of illustrating this history and knowledge. Like, there's a beautiful 2-page spread. Pete's uncle, after his mom, he and Joey's mom passes away, his uncle comes to find him, and they have a long conversation about residential schools,
Mm-hmm.
which apparently the last one closed in 1996. Like, I was 8 years old. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's not that long ago that these
Right.
things have been happening. But he's telling this story, and it's illustrated, all of the panels, with a little outline of like blue water, and then you see that it's really his tears that, like, this is the way that he's telling this story, this is how he's experiencing it. It's so beautiful. And so it's just really, really cleverly illustrated throughout, and just really beautifully, the story's really beautifully told. And um it was difficult to read for sure, but I think it was really enlightening, um the way that Pete and Joey kind of reconcile with themselves and with their community and find a more positive way of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that touches on education too. That whole whitewashing of
Mm-hmm.
cultures, uh, erasing their history, uh, and trying to merge them into whatever is considered the popular or common culture that they're living amongst at that time. Like, that's wrong, and
Yeah.
that's something I always fear and worry about in our own education is still happening. So even if those types of schools have closed, doesn't mean that the message isn't still occurring sometimes,
Yeah.
in our public schools right now. So yes, this comic I enjoyed, but it made me uncomfortable in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it I think as an educator and seeing, I work with a lot of students who are touched by poverty and who are touched by violence and things like that, and so it worries me what their futures will hold, because I mean I'm at the elementary level. um you know I don't necessarily get to see them when they move on to middle school or high school and what happens to some of them, and it scares me because you never know what will happen. And just the idea of gang violence and these children that I work with who are so sweet and don't deserve some of the situations that they're in. And hoping that they find a way to survive and rise up from it, or that we are able to somehow help them, uh, so that this situation does not happen to them. But like I said, it happens so often, and it's terrifying, and it makes me so sad. Um, and so this story, when he goes to prison, and kind of undergoes this kind of group therapy situation, um, I appreciated that he was able to make it work for him, because I feel like,
Mm-hmm.
especially as a man and ego and things like that, I mean, I would struggle with it even just as a woman, and being a more emotional and sensitive type person myself. But that vulnerability and like the admitting of things, that mistakes that have been made, and like getting to know yourself, and I mean that all touches on mental health, which is another huge issue in our country. So it's just, I think it illustrated it really well, that, you know, it is possible for people to redeem themselves, and that we all make mistakes, and some mistakes are obviously more intense than others, but you know, that dealing with the trauma, I feel like that is such an important message. And so I appreciate any kind of media that really delves into mental health and dealing with trauma, because there's so much trauma in the world, and I feel like we try to hide it, or try to, you know, ignore it, or you know, make excuses for it, and like people just don't deal with their trauma, and because of that, we have it comes out in such horrible ways in our world, and I've especially seen that this past 4 years, and so having a story like this where, you know, you full on face your trauma, and you know, I mean, you can't erase trauma, obviously. It's always going to be there. But, you know, finding ways to cope and deal with it in a positive way, you know, is important. And that's something that I felt that this story did really well. Touching upon the masks, that was the part I think that kind of hit me, because on a personal note, there was a time in my life when I was a little bit more religious, and spiritual, and at that time, my dreams were very intense, and I mean, I still have very, you know, intense dreams, but this hasn't happened in many years. But I remember times when I was feeling very challenged in my life, or, you know, there were people in my life that, you know, I feel like on a spiritual level, I knew I couldn't trust them, or something like that. So I would have these dreams, and in the dreams I would just be having a discussion with that person or something like that, and I would just like look down at a drink that I was having or something, and I'd look up and their face would change, and would have kind of like a mask like that situation. So I mean, and it's a similar in that kind of design. I don't know what that is, but it almost was dragon like in mine. And then when they would speak, like green smoke would come out their mouth, and then immediately I knew, oh God, like this isn't someone I needed to be near, and I need to get away from this person. And so, you know, that hasn't happened in many years, but I remember waking up from those dreams and feeling like super creeped out about it. But knowing that that was like a warning that, like, you know, do not trust this person. This person does not have your best interest at hand. And so when I saw that in this comic, I got that same vibe. So it just kind of like, it was like a, you know, chill down my spine. I was like, oh, I was like, I know what that is, that, you know, I know how that feels. And, you know, and that being imprinted on somebody is terrifying. So
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a lot of work to unpack that and understand it.
yeah.
This is also kind of something that's very tricky, because I think it's really important that people rely on their own communities and their own like a group of people that understand their heritage and their culture, that come from the same place to do that work. But I also recognize that the reason that they're in that situation is because of the racism and
Right.
the poverty that has been um, put upon them. Like, it's really hard to say, well, you have to do the work to fix this, even though you're not the ones that created this problem. So
Right.
it's really hard, because I do think there is something very important about doing that healing with people that understand and that have those same traditions and rituals. One part also that that really stood out to me was when they were doing their family trees,
Mm.
um, and their leader was telling her story, and kind of the addiction and the abuse and the trauma that her family experienced. And, you know, at the end, she says, what I've come to understand is that although my family's history has been so hard and filled with hopelessness, there was also a lot of strength, caring, and kindness as well. Being on a healing journey has helped me to see the whole picture much more clearly. I've learned to forgive and see the beauty of my family. And so, you know, she comes in and really recognizes that it's not these individuals' fault that they are acting this way, that they are caught within these cycles of abuse and trauma, she can recognize that they have suffered these things at the hands of these oppressors and people that have forced these things upon them. And so she is able to do that healing and experience that forgiveness, which Pete, comes to recognize he needs to do with his mother and even his absent father. That was one thing I was going to say too about surviving the city is Miquan's dad is really present and supportive. And so I think that kind of breaks that stereotype of like the absent a Native father or abusive father figure.
Yeah.
So I really appreciated that as well. But yeah, it's tough. I think it's tough to reconcile with that as a white person and also as somebody who has experienced those things. But a really, really important book. The author has worked in this sort of environment, and so really is coming in with a lot of knowledge and experience in these sort of healing programs. So I really appreciate her kind of bringing this story to life.
Yeah, it's really important. These kinds of stories are very important. Yeah, and I would love to see more graphic novels of these type stories also being used in education, because I always feel that graphic novels is a perfect way to get kids engaged anyway, because they love the pictures and things like that, and that kind of visual side of reading. But then, like I said, having these personal stories that are real and true and authentic, I think is also really important, and I think is the perfect way to portray that. Kind of like with Echo, having that teacher who was so good at teaching his classes that she actually felt she was traveling back in time,
Yeah,
and everything like that. I mean, that's part of education, is making it interesting for our students so that they want to learn more and that they feel connected to it. And I feel that graphic novels such as these is the perfect way to do that.
absolutely. So we kind of have to wrap up here. We have one more thing we want to talk about, but before we get into kind of the final thing, I did want to say, most of this
Hold on.
stuff that pretty much everything we've talked about today is Canadian. And so I would really like to see more of this kind of thing from the United States. I know, like, just off the top of my head, I know Red Planet Comics, Books and Comics, they're based in Albuquerque, is doing a lot of this work. So shout out to things like Tribal Force and the Wool of Jonesy and the people who are doing that here in the United States. But it feels like there's a lot more of that happening in Canada. They, of course, have a lot of issues there as well with how they've treated Indigenous and Native and Aboriginal people. But yeah. So anyway, lastly, we want to talk about a anthology. It's a comics collection called Moonshot, the Indigenous Comics Collection. I just read volume 1, but there is a volume 2. And so it's a collection of kind of short comic stories that get into all of these different stories from Indigenous cultures. And so I just wanted to talk about a couple that I really enjoyed, but which one stood out to you, Leigh?
My favorite was the first one that it opened with that immediately grabbed my attention, and so I believe it's an artist who works with Marvel and works on the Daredevil line of comics. Daredevil is one of my very favorite superheroes in the Marvel side of comics, and the reason I loved him even from a child is that I loved that he was disabled. I loved that he had something taken away from him, which is his sight, and that heightened his other senses, and that really is what his superpower was based on. And I loved that it was so inclusive in that way. That was kind of the first time I had seen a superhero who had a disability, and that didn't hinder him and made him stronger. And so if you've ever read anything with Daredevil, he really focuses on his sense of hearing. And so in the comics or movies or anything like that, when it's drawn or visualized, when he's looking around, seeing as he can't really see, it looks very much like radar in some ways. So it's like things sounds and vibrate, and that's how he's able to like navigate, where he is or what's happening around him. And so the opening sequence comic in Moonshot is a character. Was the character's name Vision?
Oh, good question. Let me see
It probably
here.
is a
Oh,
Vision.
her name is Echo.
Sorry,
It's called
Echo.
Vision Quest.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's what it is. I messed that up. Sorry.
Yeah,
Um,
Maya Lopez.
yes. So what happens is it's the opposite. It's of Daredevil's journey. So she is losing her hearing, and and eventually I believe becomes deaf, and so she has to rely on her sight to be able to navigate her life. And so and so much of her history, of like learning about her history and where she comes from, is from verbal stories told by her grandfather and things like that. And so the time when she lost her hearing, being able to read lips, but then like while that's happening, it turns into these vision, like like she's able to read the lips, and then like the words start to manifest in front of her type thing, and it also becomes like a visual, like almost yeah, I don't almost like a dream in some ways. And I thought that was really neat and a really interesting way, because I mean we don't, I think with Daredevil it was a lot easier to kind of visualize what that would look like if someone's blind, and then like the sound vibrations. Okay, I get that. I if I was blind, that's how I can see that. But I think someone who's deaf and then having to rely on the visual side of that is really hard to portray in a comic,
Mm.
or even on film and stuff like that, because we rely so much on the sound of things as well. And because I can't read lips, and everything like that, that would be really hard for me to like just turn the sound off on something, not having captions, and trying to figure out what's happening in this situation, type thing. So being able to portray that well in a graphic novel, and well, or in film or anything like that, I really appreciate that. And using the ASL is also a really cool way of interpreting that visually in the comic as well. So yeah, I don't know. I It's one of those once again, disability that was turned into a strength. In the story, she's struggling a little bit at the beginning, but then she starts to kind of like figure out that this is actually, her means of power. She has an ability that nobody else, in her family had, and so that was really interesting. So this was just a snippet of that story, but it made me very curious and want to learn more about her character and how that would relate into the Daredevil world. So yeah, and I'm not sure if it was intended for that either, if it was just intended to be a short story. But I would love to see this character manifested in the Marvel universe, most definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll make a quick correction. It is Indian Sign Language.
Yes, I'm so
Um,
sorry. Yes.
uniquely different from American Sign Language,
Mm-hmm.
which every culture has their own, which is pretty cool. But yeah, so it was written and illustrated by David Mack. And yeah, it's really beautiful, and I think it's a really great way to start the collection, because it really kind of totally immerses you into a world that's very different, I think,
Mm-hmm.
than what we're used to seeing.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of ones that I just wanted to shout out real quick. One I really liked was called Ocheck, which is a story that is specifically about the Big Dipper. And so it's written by David Robertson, and it's a Cree story
Mm-hmm.
about um, an otter and a lynx that go, so way back when the earth was just covered in snow and ice, and they go and find a place where there is warmth seeping through, and so they break through, but then they catch the attention of the sky people who shoots Ocheck, but he is immortalized within the stars, and that's the Big Dipper. And so we are always reminded of his sacrifice to bring warmth to the earth 6 months out of the year. So it's a really cool story. I love the artwork. It's very kind of like video game kind of reminded me of that. And so I thought it would be actually a really cool video game to like go on this journey to go like bring warmth to the world. I think it would be really cool. So I really liked that one. The other one that I wanted to shout out real quick is called Strike and Bolt. So it was written by Michael Sayashni. Sayashi. And it is a Kado tale. And it's about two brothers. One is wild and strong, one is clever and quick. And they use their powers of thunder and lightning to investigate the mysterious disappearance of their mother. So it kind of goes into, the disappearance of Indigenous women as well. But what I really like about it is it feels very like, it's got like a 60s kind of look, kind of that sort of original space superhero kind of story, but telling this traditional story. And this crops up a lot. They talk about how there are these monsters that are called kaua, and that also means ghost or monster, that come and eat the Hasinai people. And that crops up time and time again, these people that come and eat and destroy, and that's what white people do. So it's that ghost, they come and destroy. But what I really like about it is that at the end they use this piece of technology to bring their mother back. So not only, again, does it have this kind of triumphant, hopeful story, but it's also kind of about how these two brothers have to work together and use their strengths together in order to overcome this obstacle. And then it's also kind of got that fun kind of classic comic feel and look. So all of the stories in this volume, and I'm sure the other volumes as well, are very unique. They all have very specific art styles, and they tell their stories in a very different way, and they come from cultures from all over North America. So it's really cool to see this collection of stories, to kind of learn some of these traditions and these histories. So highly recommend. I think it's a really great collection, and it's really cool to see somebody make the effort to bring all of these Indigenous creators together to put this together.
Yes, I agree. I love anthologies, especially for comics and graphic novels and things like that, because I love short stories, and I love seeing all the different takes that different comic artists do on something, like if it's a theme or anything like that. I love the different art styles and the way people tell different stories, and so I just think that anthologies are fascinating, and I wish there were more of those commonly out there that you could find and purchase, because I think that they're really cool, and it's a great way to kind of like diversify comics and storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you have anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up?
I don't think so. Somebody fix our education system, please.
Right? Yes. Call on me, call on you, call on everybody. Yeah, so just to wrap up, I would repeat again that this work is ongoing. Indigenous, Native, and Aboriginal First Nation women are at a very high risk of going missing and being murdered, and that is something that needs attention. It needs to be talked about if you have the money, please donate to local organizations that are working to help in those situations. Definitely use your activism in a way that's going to make a difference. Make sure you're giving voice to those organizations and listening to those voices, and not just taking up space, and not just saying, hey, look what I'm doing, but actually, do the hard work. So I'm trying, and I know Leigh is trying. We're all trying. So again, please let us know if there's other ways we can help. But we appreciate you sharing this time with us, and we're really grateful that these things exist so that we can talk about them.
Absolutely. So this has been another episode of File 741. I'm Leigh.
And I'm Beckah.
Thank you for listening, and please like us on Facebook or follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can tune into all of our podcasts on iTunes, Podbean, YouTube, or at thefeminerdfiles.net.